Hello. I hope that everybody had a Merry Christmas, or whatever it is that you do during this time of the year. Um, we got a lot to do. Okay, so this class is relatively condensed, and so we have to cover a fair amount of material. And so I have your clarification questions. I'm going to go over those. Okay, and my hope is that everybody's going to be pretty well prepared for the test that you're going to be taking tomorrow. So, one of the questions that I had was surrounding anti-science. Okay, and this anti-science fits within the idea of science, which is the objective search for truth using methods that are replicatable and observable and fallible, disprovable, so on and so forth. Um, Going along the spectrum there, we have pseudoscience, which essentially dresses up things that are not science. So dresses up opinion. Um, it makes it sound sciencey because it thinks that there's some extra credibility for science. Actually, pseudoscience is actually seems to really love science because it thinks that it makes it more credible, but it is not science. It is just essentially kind of taking something that is not true and wrapping it up with science to make it look credible. Okay. Um, then we have our last one is anti-science. So this is where the question came. And anti-science is something that we haven't traditionally talked that much about. But anti-science is actually running rampant these days. So these days, there's a lot less respect for science than there used to be. Okay, there's a lot of people who reject what it is that scientists say for a number of reasons. So, for example, what can scientists tell us about global warming? They're conflicted, and so on and so forth. Um, you know, Distrusting the piles and piles of data we have on the evolution of species over time. Essentially, kind of rejecting what science has to say, not because you disagree with how it was collected, because you don't agree that science can tell you things. Okay, and it's very dangerous because then what you have is there's no objective, fallible proof left. Now it's all based on how loud people can shout their opinions. Okay, that's scary. Okay. Same set of questions there. Asked another pretty foundational piece, which is we talk about science. The causes of science can be found in the environment. Why not look where the light is good? This is a core belief surrounding applied behavioral science. Okay, particularly behavior analysis, which is the science that most of us operate from, is the belief that um, causes of behavior are reinforcement. Okay, reinforcement is essentially an environmental event. It is something external to the behavior that's occurring, typically external to the organism itself. It is an environmental event that drives more behavior in the future, just like punishment is an environmental event that decreases this. We don't look at these things as representative these behaviors representative of any internal processes, anything unobservable. That's just not the way that we look at things. And there are many people who do have different beliefs on this. And maybe some of the stuff that they say can contribute to the conversation. However, Skinner set us on a path from the very beginning that we don't look at behavior as being representative of something else. We want to understand why behavior occurs. And I can tell you, as a science, we've done really, really well in application based on having this core belief system. While we're talking a little bit about these kind of wider scale sort of things there, one person asked a question about the dimensions of behavior analysis. Is one more important than the others? So this is not an applied behavior analysis class. This is a research methods class. Okay, we're going to talk about the research methods that you'll often use in applied behavior analysis. But there's a reason that we spend a relatively short amount of time talking about the 7 dimensions of applied behavior analysis. You will get it in applied behavior analysis classes, so don't worry. You'll spend a lot of time talking about it, and every class is going to actually have a different opinion about which one is more important than the other ones. Okay. Um, I'm a research methods instructor. Okay, I'm going to tell you that the analytic piece is the most important piece. Okay, because it's also essentially the analytic dimension is the one where you are proving that one thing causes another. That's what my bread and butter is. That's what the classes that I teach at the undergraduate and the graduate level are primarily about. However, there's use for all of these other bits here. But I would say that if you can't necessarily prove that something causes that one thing is causing another. So if you can't prove behavioral causation, that you don't have the analytic element in there, that analytic dimension in there, it doesn't matter if you have generality of your findings. It doesn't matter if they're socially valid because you don't necessarily have findings in the first place. Okay, so I will say that the analytic one is a prerequisite to all the other dimensions. This actually does bring us to another set of questions. People had questions about social validity and generality. Okay, so generality is just essentially how much is it that what I found in my experiment would hold to other times, places, so on and so forth. Okay, so if I have evaluated an experimental approach to teaching a skill for a child. Okay, so I've evaluated this experimental approach to teaching the child this skill. That's cool. And I've done it in controlled settings. I don't really care that much about how well the kid does in these controlled settings. What I actually really care about is, would this kid learn with this technique in their natural learning setting? Okay, would they learn with this technique in other settings? Can I actually expand where we're educating this child? Would this hold for other children? Okay, I want to know how well what I found in session spreads out to other spots in the universe. That's what we're talking about in terms of generality. Social validity is a different thing. So I could come up with great generality of a technique. So I could spend a whole bunch of time teaching my kids to cuss. Okay, and I could use good, solid reinforcement-based techniques to get them to swear as much as I ever wanted them to. Okay, and I could do that in the home environment. And I'm guessing I'd get generality to their school environment. I'd probably get a letter home about that. I'd get generality to when we're out in the community. I'd get many, many mean eyes focused back at me for having done that. The reason I would get these letters and these mean eyes, so on and so forth, is that wasn't a socially valid target. I am not doing something that is improving the kid's life. I am not doing something that is going to make them function better in society. Okay, and that's one of those dimensions is social validity. It essentially fits within the dimensions, and the reality is social validity is typically done in one way, which is essentially asking people's opinions about the intervention. Okay, and there were questions that came up around social validity based on subjective evaluation, which is basically, hey, how much did you like the evaluation? How much did you like these outcomes? Okay, and I can tell you, if people have been waiting for improvement in their child's behavior for a long time, and you do anything that's better, they're going to say you're great, and you're going to get great subjective evaluation without a problem. Okay, or if they're already to the point where they're so fried that they can't even notice anything good happening to them, you're going to get horrible subjective evaluation. So the biases within the subjective evaluation doesn't make it useless to collect the data. However, it does mean that maybe there is another approach that we could take. This other approach that Polling's talking about is social comparison. Okay, so oftentimes if people are working and they're brought in to change an individual's behavior, they're brought in to change the individual's behavior because it is different than what you typically see. Okay, so if you're brought in to change the behavior of a child, the child is probably not acting like other kids. Okay, you're brought in to change the behavior of a business. It is probably not functioning the way that other successful businesses are functioning. Okay, if you're brought in to help with a dog, okay, people aren't going to pay you money to work with a dog if you're not bringing them into some sort of a normal range. You're brought in because they're barking too much, they're acting aggressive, so on and so forth. 'Tis the season. social comparison is essentially find a group that is competent in this area. Okay, so find a group of kids that are behaving the way that they should be behaving, and then you compare what you basically compare your outcomes. Did you make the kid like those other kids? Okay, this is actually a very useful and very objective approach to doing it. Okay, there are, however, some limitations. Okay, if you don't have a good comparison group to compare people to, so if you have an individual who has relatively limited capacities, and the only comparison group you have to them is individuals who have basically completely intact capacities. Okay, that's not a good comparison group. It's going to make it look like you fell way short of where you could. Or what if you're in an area wherein all their peers are acting a fool? Okay, all their peers are acting badly. Making them move to being like all their other peers is not going to be a particularly good thing to do. Okay, and so this social comparison takes a little finesse to get it right. Somebody asked about the cardinal rule in research. Why do we have this cardinal rule? And when we're talking about this cardinal rule, that is just that you change. If you want to be able to say anything, you change one thing at a time. Okay, and so if if I have a hard time finding my keys, okay, and my wife is kind enough to try to help me find them. And so what she does is while I'm upstairs, she turns on the light and she cleans up the living room. Okay? And lo and behold, I come downstairs and I find my keys. One, I can say it probably is what my wonderful wife has done for me. Okay? However, I can't say if it was turning the light on that made it easier to find, or if it was cleaning the living room that made it easier to find. Could be an interaction of the two, but that's a whole much more complicated thing to prove. If you change two things at one time, you can't attribute the effects to either of those one things. Okay, and that's why it's a cardinal rule. If you change more than one thing at a time, you can't say why you got the changes. And lastly, somebody asked about methods of data collecting with the least bias. Okay. This is complicated, okay, because reality, if you have humans collect data, you are subject to bias, okay? Whether it be direct observation, you are subject to bias, okay? People might want to please the experimenter, data collectors might want to please the experimenter, and so if they know the conditions, they might try to shift their definitions just a little bit so that it looks like what this person wants to see. They might have preconceived notions, so on and so forth. And the toughest piece is that can be bias that is systematically different between phases. Okay? Excuse me. If you have a computer collecting data, so automatically collected data, the bias will all be in the same direction. Okay? Computers do exactly what they're programmed to do. And so those are biased data. Okay. If you have people reporting indirect data to you, so surveys, so on and so forth, where they are difference between direct and indirect data collection. Direct, the most direct is having automated recording. Okay, but you can also have direct observation where somebody is sitting there recording the actual behaviors that you're interested in. So those are direct sorts of methods. Okay, indirect methods are you ask people about it. Okay, so you ask the caregivers, hey, is Johnny having fewer problematic behaviors? Okay, a direct measure would be you sit there with a pen and a pad and you record throughout the day how many problematic behaviors Johnny's having. The indirect method is you ask their mom, hey, how many problematic behaviors do they have? Okay, those are very different approaches there. But back to indirect measures and bias. Sorry for an aside there. In terms of indirect measures and bias, indirect measures are biased by changes in the way that people remember things. So sometimes people's memory can be a little bit, rosy or the other direction. Sometimes the way you ask the question can make people say things. So any sort of, you have to be really careful about how you set up any observation system, whether it be direct observation or indirect observation, to be very attentive to bias. Okay, because all of these methods are subject to bias. You just have to make sure that you set the situation for the individual collecting the data. So in the case of self-report, it's the person who's making the self-report. In the case of direct observation, it's the person who's actually recording the data, writing down the data, their observations and their data. You have to make sure that the situations are free from any sorts of factors that might move them one direction or another, expectations, belief that you want to see one thing, so on and so forth. All of them can be good, all of them can be very challenging. And with that, I hope that everybody has a marvelous weekend, and I will be talking to you again next week. Thanks. Bye.